Have you ever stood in your garden on a quiet evening, looking at leaves riddled with holes, and stopped to wonder how it came to this? Have you ever felt that despite watching over your plants every day, the landscape seemed to change completely in just a few days? Have you ever bought chemicals thinking that this time would be different? Have you ever believed that if you just reduced the insects, the garden would become healthy? But what happened after that? Why do the pests keep coming back? Why is it that despite repeated treatments, the vegetables look weaker than before? Why does the soil appear to grow tired? Why are the small creatures you used to see all the time suddenly disappearing? Perhaps the problem isn't a lack of effort. Perhaps there is something inherently forced about the way we try to protect our gardens. Many people continue their home gardening in a very similar cycle. A hole appears in a leaf. You find a bug. You hurry to take countermeasures. For a moment, you feel a sense of relief, a feeling that you've handled it. But after a while, the same thing happens again. In some cases, the situation becomes even more troublesome than before. The vigor of the seedlings slows, and the expression of the soil changes. A garden that was once full of signs of life becomes unnaturally silent. That silence is not peace. Rather, it is a signal that the equilibrium of the garden has collapsed. When you grow vegetables for a long time, you begin to see things clearly. A truly vibrant garden is not one without a single insect. A truly vibrant garden is one where pests alone do not multiply one-sidedly. This difference may sound small, but it fundamentally changes how you view a garden. If you consider everything that flies or crawls as an enemy, your first reaction will always be exclusion. But within the garden, there are living things working to suppress the momentum of pests in places we don't notice. When you think this way, your questions change. Instead of, "What should I spray?" the question becomes, "What is this garden lacking?" This is why the Amish approach to gardening feels so fresh to many. They don't think about using something stronger. Their first thought is how to make the garden itself stronger. They observe which plants should be placed near each other. They watch closely to see when and what kind of beneficial insects gather. They ensure that vegetables of the same family do not follow each other in the same spot, creating a flow that makes it difficult for pests and diseases to lie in wait. And they walk the garden every day, not to attack something, but to notice changes early. Because of this stance, the garden does not become a place of forced suppression. It becomes a place where various lives work together to maintain a just right balance. This way of thinking aligns with modern concepts of sustainable gardening, observing, first preventing early, and layering multiple gentle methods rather than immediately suppressing with force. When you see it this way, your feelings toward garden work change. The sensation of constantly fighting the same problem begins to fade. Instead, you notice how each small effort is connected. There is meaning in where you plant a single flower. A slight change in planting style can change how insects attach. A short morning patrol can create a huge difference later. You come to realize that a garden is not a place to be subdued by force, but a place to arrange relationships. Perhaps what was lacking wasn't effort. Perhaps you were just working hard in a direction that made the garden suffer more. From here on, a different way of beginning is possible. It's not an exaggerated miracle or magic that solves everything. It is simply understanding the garden a little more deeply than before. If the answer isn't found in a new bottle of medicine, it might be found in the arrangement of the garden itself. It might be in the scent of the plants growing nearby, or in the presence of the beneficial insects you had unknowingly driven away. It lies within the power of balance that nature inherently possesses. If we can stop for a moment and listen to that flow, the garden will surely show us a different expression. When your perspective on the garden shifts, the locations where problems occur look different as well. Nothing begins at the moment a hole appears in a leaf or an insect becomes visible. In many cases, the flow has been decided long before that. Which plants did you plant next to each other? What flowers did you welcome into the garden? Is the air there? something that makes beneficial insects want to stay. Each of these choices slowly shapes the strength of the garden. A garden with the power to protect itself is not one that reacts in a panic after a problem occurs. It is a garden that is arranged from the start so that problems are unlikely to grow large. The more a person has faced a garden over the years, the less they view a single vegetable in isolation. They look at what is around it. They see which plants bring calm when nearby, which scents confuse the insects, and which flowers invite allies. This approach is very quiet and may seem modest, but in reality it is profoundly logical. A garden arranged so that plants help each other takes on a different expression than one where vegetables are merely lined up. Within it, multiple layers of small mutual support are born. A clear example of this is scattering flowers and herbs among the vegetables. Marigolds are well known, but what matters is not the name itself, but their role within the garden. The small yellow and orange colors seen between the green leaves are not just there to brighten the appearance. Near the soil, they make certain problems less likely to occur, and for insects targeting the leaves, they help make the intended vegetable harder to find. By planting them intentionally and repeatedly nearby, rather than at random, they become a living shield rather than a mere decoration. Imagine a scene where basil is next to tomatoes, chives are near lettuce and dill, or small flowers are near brassicas. The combinations found there are not placed by chance. Their respective scents, growth habits, and blooming periods change the very air of the garden. They create an environment that isn't too comfortable for pests, while creating a settled place for the vegetables. Some plants even serve as decoys, shifting the gaze of pests and diverting attention away from the main vegetables. When you think of it this way, you realize that gardening is less like a confrontation and more like guidance. However, confusing the pests is only half the battle. A truly reassuring garden is one that can invite allies. Placing dill, fennel, sweet alyssum, and other small flowered plants in the garden is not just about adding color, it is about welcoming workers. Many know ladybugs, but they aren't the only ones. Lacewings, parasitic wasps, and predatory insects moving near the soil surface also quietly support the garden. They are inconspicuous. They don't show dramatic changes immediately, but it is these small existences that stop pests from multiplying all at once. The interesting thing is that these beneficial insects won't settle in just by waiting. If a garden is too wide and empty merely orderly, it isn't comfortable for them. They need nectar. They need pollen. They need places to rest and places to hide. This is why a corner where a bit of a natural atmosphere remains a dill stalk that bloomed late, or a place that hasn't been cleaned up too perfectly, becomes unexpectedly important. If you chase only perfect order in appearance, you can end up stripping away the garden's power. A truly strong garden is one where diverse lives quietly come and go. At this point, you can see that companion planting and the effort to invite allies are not separate tricks. On one hand, you are creating a garden that is hard for pests to approach. On the other, you are creating a garden that is easy for allies to work in. When these two overlap, the garden gradually changes. The instances of leaves being covered in scars overnight decrease. Small problems no longer spread all at once, and the center of care shifts from driving away to watching over. However, if you become too complacent here, you will overlook a flow that is not yet visible. Even if you plant flowers, invite allies, and the air of the garden begins to settle, if you continue to plant the same vegetables in the same spot, a different kind of memory will remain in the soil. Problems are not only occurring on the surface of the leaves. There are things that quietly accumulate within the layering of the seasons. To truly make a garden easier to manage, you need the perspective of not just what to plant around it, but where to plant it next. A garden may look like it's in the same place, but it is something that should be grown by moving it slightly every year. As allies gradually return to the garden, and meaning is born from the combination of plants, your heart becomes much lighter than before. Instances of leaves being severely eaten decrease, and small disturbances are less likely to spread widely overnight. However, after continuing for several seasons, you may find that the same troubles return. You planted flowers, invited beneficial insects, and the air of the garden settled. Yet there are moments when you wonder why similar problems arise again. It is then that you first see that not all problems manifest on the surface of the leaves. Sometimes, the fire seeds of the next season remain in a quieter place within the soil and the memory of the field. Most people feel an urge to plant the same vegetable again in a spot where it succeeded. For example, it is very natural to want to plant tomatoes again this year in the spot where they bore fruit so well last year. You feel drawn to place the same family of plants in the furrow where brassicas grew well. The better the memory of the harvest, the stronger the desire to use the spot exactly as it was. But a field is not built solely on human satisfaction. For pests and diseases, that familiar spot is a place of convenience. They wait in the soil, remembering what was there the previous year. Some wait patiently near dead roots and shallow layers of soil or among surrounding remnants. When a new seedling arrives in that spot, they move all at once, as if a dining table has been prepared for them in the same location again. This is why crop rotation, though not flashy, holds such profound meaning. While the term might sound like something meant for large farmlands, it is immensely useful in a home garden. There is no need to overthink it. The key is to group vegetables that tend to share similar troubles as allies and move those groups to different locations each year. Nightshades tomatoes, eggplants peppers, cucurbits, cucumbers, squash zucchini, brassicas, cabbage, kale, broccoli. Legumes are considered in a separate flow. By shifting locations group by group, it becomes difficult for pests and diseases to lie in wait. The soil is also spared the same burden year after year, allowing it to breathe more easily. The beauty of crop rotation lies in the fact that it is hard to see as a dramatic change. It makes no sound and offers no grand spectacle. However, it possesses the power to quietly lock the door against problems that used to enter through the same entrance every year. The more experienced a person becomes, the more they value how that lock is turned. Some record where they planted what in a small notebook. Some draw simple diagrams to remember. Others hold a map of the field in their minds. The method doesn't matter. What matters is not leaving the same path open for failure. Yet crop rotation alone is not enough to keep a field in order. A field still requires the eyes and hands of a human. Not eyes that rush in panic after a problem has grown large, but eyes that notice while the problem is still small. This is why the morning field is special. The air is still soft, the leaves are not yet fully damaged, and it is a time when the movements and traces of insects are easiest to find. A calm person does not simply walk past the furrows. They turn over a leaf. They look at the base of the stem. They notice a cluster of tiny eggs. They take note of the difference in how something was chewed. Even if the culprit is not visible, they try to read the presence of what might be there. Take, for instance, the hornworm on tomatoes. Its green body blends into the leaves and stems with startling accuracy. Because they are hard to find, many people overlook them. But they always leave traces, tiny dark pellets, dropped on the leaves or at the base of the plant. If you find those, following the line directly above often leads you to their form. On squash or zucchini, eggs may be clustered on the underside of leaves. On potatoes, conspicuous insects may begin to increase little by little. Picking these off by hand at this stage is very modest work, but it is extremely precise. You intervene only where necessary and do not needlessly harm other creatures. It is quiet, yet devoid of waste. Perhaps the greatest value of this habit is not just reducing insects, but changing the very way you relate to the field. Instead of only facing the field when a problem occurs, you begin to notice small changes in your daily life. A leaf color that is slightly different than usual, a way of being eaten that feels unnatural, eggs that weren't there yesterday but are there today. When you can notice such changes, the field suddenly ceases to be an unmanageable place, because you can gently set things right before they become major troubles. A person stops being at the mercy of the field and begins to walk in step with it. At this point, The foundation of the field is quite solid. The combinations of plants have meaning. Beneficial insects find it easy to work vegetables of the same family, move to new spots each year, and early signs are not easily missed. Still, there are times when the weather changes abruptly, or a certain type of insect increases all at once, and human observation and hands alone cannot keep up. In those moments, what is needed is not a return to the old ways of total suppression. It is choosing a method of gentle support that does not destroy the balance the field has finally begun to regain. The next thing to consider is how to provide that quiet assistance. When meaning is born in the arrangement of the field, the soil is no longer subjected to the same burdens, and daily morning patrols reveal small changes. The garden becomes much more peaceful. Instances of leaves being suddenly devoured decrease, and opportunities to take action before a problem grows large increase. However, the field does not always move according to a person's schedule. Temperatures may rise abruptly. Rain may continue making the air heavy. There are weeks when insects increase with unexpected speed. In such times, you may feel that hand-picking and morning observations are not enough. But that does not mean you must immediately return to the strong methods of the past. There are ways to provide a little help while protecting the equilibrium of the field. What matters here is supporting the flow rather than suppressing it. One of the primary tools in this effort is neem oil. The reason it is relied upon is not because it is flashy or shows massive changes immediately. In fact, it is the opposite. It can slightly slow the momentum of pests in a way that is unlikely to destroy the air of the garden. When leaf-eating insects begin to increase, and you feel that manual responses are not keeping up, neem oil becomes just the right help. However, even here, the important thing is not the mindset that you should use it for everything. If you use it, it should be limited to when the field truly needs help after careful observation. The timing of use is also vital. Choosing the evening when the sunlight has softened and the movement of pollinating insects has decreased minimizes the burden on the field. In other words, the value of neem oil lies not in its strength, but in its modesty. Diatomaceous earth is a tool that lives within a similar mindset. When you first hear of it, it may seem like something special, but what it does is very quiet. It simply creates a fine barrier that is difficult for slugs and crawling insects to pass through. It only holds meaning when scattered on dry soil and must be reapplied if it rains. Therefore, it is not something where one application is the end. But therein lies the beauty of this tool. Instead of forcing a change on the entire field, it can be used like gently drawing a line only in the places you want to protect. Diatomaceous earth is not a replacement for observation, nor is it a replacement for clever planting or crop rotation. Still, by placing it in the necessary amount, in the necessary spots, it helps slow the speed at which problems approach. It lacks flashiness, but that is enough. Perhaps what a field truly needs is a flow that is hard to collapse rather than a conspicuous solution. Similarly, the garlic and chili spray made from kitchen ingredients holds a similar charm. It is neither expensive, nor does it require special techniques. The very idea of trying to protect the field using familiar things is very natural. This kind of spray does not need to be spoken of as a magic cure-all. To do so would create an unnatural gap between actual function and expectation. But if considered as a supplement for distancing, it is a very reassuring presence. The strong scent of garlic and the irritation of chili are not comfortable for certain types of small visitors. Thus, it can create a window of time for them to keep their distance. That time alone gives the grower the leeway to arrange other parts of the field. The key is not to make that one bottle carry the weight of everything, but to use it as a small helping hand to support the overall flow of the field. Looking back on the flow so far, the most important thing is to return to the initial mindset. The field is not a place to be silenced by force, but a place to arrange the balance between living things. You have contrived combinations of plants, invited beneficial insects, moved vegetables of the same family little by little, and ensured that morning changes are not missed. It is because that foundation exists that these gentle helping methods come to life. Neem oil is not a replacement for the strength of the field itself. Diatomaceous earth will not erase every problem. Homemade sprays are the same. All are meant to support the original flow. When you can think this way, you stop making extreme choices. You become much more settled in facing the field than when you thought the only options were to do nothing or to strike hard. As you continue with the field, you come to realize that what is truly useful is an appropriate move, even if small, rather than a strong one. It is about adding only as much as the field needs at that moment, rather than moving in a big, panicked way when a problem appears. With just a little support, the field can sometimes regain its own power to recover. And as you grow accustomed to such thinking, you notice that there are even quieter ways of protecting things, preparing forms that are difficult to approach in the first place, rather than reacting after insects have arrived. Including thinly placed ash covers that protect the furrows, or even the presence of well-managed poultry, there are yet other ways of protection remaining in the field. What we will look at next are such contrivances for protecting without conflict. When you are involved with a garden for a long time, you gradually realize that protecting it isn't always about taking strong action. In fact, what truly helps is creating forms in advance where conflict is unnecessary. You can protect a field without using strong-smelling chemicals or running around in a panic. Sometimes, simply placing a quiet boundary in just the right spot makes it difficult for pests to approach. The more you learn about this way of protection, the clearer the feeling becomes that a garden is not a place for battle, but a place for arrangement. One clear example of this is wood ash. The ash left over from a wood stove or a bonfire may seem mundane at first glance, but depending on how it's used, it can become a very reliable presence in the garden. For creatures that prefer damp environments, such as slugs, a thin layer of dry ash placed around the base of a plant acts as a boundary that is difficult to cross. The beauty of this method lies not only in the fact that it costs almost nothing, but also in the way it reevaluates and repurposes what is already familiar. However, the key here is moderation. Using more of anything is not necessarily better. Wood ash is not a cure-all, and overusing it can create a different burden. But if used thinly and carefully, while observing the garden's condition, it becomes a meaningful, quiet defense. It isn't flashy, but such contrivances are what support the garden's stability. If wood ash is a quiet line drawn on the ground, then insect nets and covers are contrivances that close the entrance in a more explicit way. The idea is to make it difficult for pests to reach the leaves in the first place, rather than dealing with them after they have attached. For brassica vegetables like cabbage, kale, and broccoli, the benefit of this method is particularly clear. These plants are targeted by insects from a young age, and if you are careless, eggs will be laid on the undersides of the leaves. Dealing with them one by one after that is a massive task. However, if you provide a light cover from the seedling stage, you can let in light air and water while keeping only the insects away. That alone makes the garden much more peaceful. The advantage of these physical protections is that there is no need to subdue an existing problem with force. You simply prepare a form in advance where the problem itself is unlikely to start. Even for squash and cucumbers, these protections are vital during the period when the stems are young and weak. By simply getting through the period when specific insects are most active, the plants become much sturdier and less susceptible to later damage. When flowers begin to bloom or pollination is required, you can simply remove the cover. In other words, the idea is not to stay closed forever, but to protect only as long as necessary. Because of this flexibility, the garden does not become stifling. By discerning when to guard and when to open the garden, can receive both the flow of nature and human ingenuity. As we talk about these quiet boundaries, another movement appears within the garden landscape: the presence of poultry, such as chickens or guinea fowl. There is a certain reassuring richness in seeing small poultry moving about the garden at dawn or dusk. It makes you feel that the garden is not just a place where vegetables are lined up, but a place where life comes and goes. They peck at insects and small creatures near the ground, helping to keep parts of the field clean. Moreover, their presence itself makes the time spent gazing at the garden feel a bit softer, strengthening the sense that the garden and life are connected. However, a realistic perspective is vital here as well. The presence of chickens alone does not solve every garden problem. If given too much freedom, they can damage young seedlings, scratch up the soil, or even go after ripening fruit. Therefore, to use them effectively, you must consider time and place. Determine which plots they are allowed in, limit them to times when they can be watched, and be clear about which part of the field you want them to help with. In this way, poultry becomes an effortless part of the garden. Humans don't leave everything to them. They share roles. With that sense, the garden becomes much more stable. Wood, ash, covers, and poultry each looks different, but the underlying philosophy is the same. Protecting a field does not always mean defeating something. It means placing quiet boundaries for things you don't want to enter while leaving proper pathways for things that are necessary. It means guarding when you should guard and opening when you should open. Through this accumulation, the garden gradually begins to possess a reasonable strength. Even without violent means, you can create a flow where pests are unlikely to increase by layering calm contrivances. As the garden's defense is gradually arranged, your next concern becomes how to welcome the next season, not just the current one. In fact, the quietest and most important preparation may begin not in the busy middle of summer, but toward the end of the season. When the leaves have fulfilled their roles, the air turns cold, and the field slowly heads toward sleep. That is when the serenity of the following year is shaped. As a single season slowly nears its end, the air in the garden begins to look a little different. The intense light of midsummer softens, and the morning air begins to carry a hint of cold. The once bustling furrows take on a settled expression. Plants that bore much fruit wear a quietness as if they have fulfilled their roles, and the time they spent living through the season is etched into the color of their leaves and the form of their stems. At this time, some people want to clear everything away quickly. It is natural to feel that ending things cleanly feels good. However, if you have been with a garden for a long time, you realize that the end of this season is the vital time that determines the next beginning. The end does not exist merely to close things off, it exists to quietly arrange the next flow. Therefore, the way you clean up at the end of the season requires a settled perspective. It is not simply about removing everything. It is not necessarily the case that you are safe just because you emptied everything quickly. First, you want to discern what should be taken out of the garden. Plants that clearly show disease parts, where pest damage remains strongly, or stems and leaves that seem likely to drag problems into next year. These are worth removing carefully. If you are ambiguous here, it becomes easy to carry the same problems over to the next season. However, on the other hand, it is not a matter of cleaning everything uniformly. What is important is to choose. Decide what to reduce and what to leave while observing the flow of the garden. This is because building a strong garden for the next season is not just about erasing problems. It is equally important to leave room for helpful lives to return. Sometimes, it is okay for one corner of the field to have a bit of a natural atmosphere. Leaving a small place where beneficial insects can easily overwinter, rather than exposing everything, can become the strength of the entire garden. This is different from neglecting it. It is not about slacking off. Rather, it is the wisdom to distinguish between what is necessary and what is excessive. It is about arranging with a reason, not cleaning in a hurry. That difference will gradually appear in the expression of the garden the following spring. Looking back on the flow so far, it becomes clear that nothing we did to protect the field was a disjointed trick. It all began with a change in the question we directed at the garden. It started with thinking about what was lacking rather than what to hit it with. The contrivance of planting plants nearby was not just for appearance, but to create a form of mutual support. Increasing small flowers was not just for decoration, but to create places where beneficial insects could work. Crop rotation was to soften the memory of the soil and cut off the return path for the same problems. The morning patrol was a time not just to catch bugs, but to catch the changes in the field early on. Furthermore, we used neem oil, diatomaceous earth, and homemade sprays as gentle helps only when necessary. And the presence of ash covers and poultry brought to the garden a form of protection without conflict. When you line up each of these elements, the garden ceases to be a place where humans must constantly fight. It becomes a place that is gradually arranged and slowly holds its own. You finally realize that the goal is not the total eradication of pests, but creating a flow where pests alone do not increase one-sidedly. As that sensation grows, your attitude toward the garden changes. There is no longer a need to act forcefully. Instead, looking closely, noticing early, and lending a hand in just the right amount become the priorities. You come to realize that what a garden truly needs is harmony, not domination. Ultimately, what remains is more than just the harvest yield or the beauty of the leaves. The garden even changes the way a person's mind works. Not rushing to find an answer, not trying to erase what is in front of you immediately. When arranging something, looking at the overall flow first. Such sensations live on quietly even outside the garden. A person who has finished one season can welcome the next with a lighter heart than before, because they no longer have to search for some new magical solution. Everything that was needed was already within the garden. It was in the soil, in the arrangement of the plants, in the work of the small insects, and in your own eyes and hands that have faced it a little more each day. When you can think that way, perhaps the garden ceases to be just a place to grow food and becomes a place where humans reconcile with nature.